kingdoms are deserted. The red of daybreak no longer infects the ruins' facades, receiving only a mute light from this red. We fly over history with red wings. Taken with fire, a thief has taught the phoenix to fill the attics with onions, garlic, coconut, dry figs, black pepper, and raisins. This dosage, an effective remedy for unrequited love. Reviving the burnt ashes, the same thief demands that the genealogical tree, blessed by the city, drug itself only with its own unripe fruits. Who dares hope for the withering of this tree? Who dares refute the crime of its secular age? In May 2009, the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa hosted a gathering of writers and artists in Morocco in the form of a Souk Ukaz, a regional tradition of intellectual and artistic exchange. The topic: writing in and beyond the city. The journey began in Fez.
Since the first time I came to Morocco and to Fez, I was astonished by the way you are oriented less by rational directions than to the senses. Somebody talked about a blind man who was really hearing all the noises and smelling, and he could orientate himself through all the other senses. That's why I call Fez a sensual city. That means a city that allows you to be guided by your senses.
It's impossible not to get jostled in the narrow alleys in the old city of Fez. Many streets inside the Medina are slim alleyways. You must turn sideways to scoot past others. It is a place where anyone who enters for the first time will undoubtedly get lost. Built in the 8th century to thwart invasions, the design of Fez to a newcomer is a complex labyrinth.
One of the experts in the literary world on labyrinths, at least he seems to own them, it's a sort of trademark for Borges, that he always says that a labyrinth is not chaos, it's actually quite the opposite. There's always a mastermind behind the labyrinth. It's architecture with a purpose, and the purpose is to confuse people. That's why, the sameness and the symmetry in a labyrinth is, in a way, meant to make you doubt where you are. You could say a labyrinth is a map of the human mind, for better or for worse. And Fez, a city like Fez, is a map of human life. It's not a rationale or a preconceived mental structure imposed on the land.
Labyrinths are a recurring theme in Borges' work. He describes a labyrinth as one devised by men, destined to be deciphered by men.
The fabric of the Medina is actually very interesting in the whole Islamic world. It's really interconnected. There's an entity doesn't exist by itself. It's very difficult to see where a house starts and the other one ends. So that's probably reflecting also the social fabric. Of course, your house is a level into, metaphorically speaking, ascend into knowledge, so you can ascend into light. God is light. So probably as you're going up, you are going toward light, toward God. So that's why your only vision is a vertical one. You are here to worship God and to live a relationship with God. Your neighbor is...
Fez is to step not only back in time, but inside a cross-cultural exploration that defies much of what the Western world defines as urban. Literature has generally gravitated to cities as a theme, and now more than ever, these hot spheres of innovation and creative destruction dominate our imagination of the world. Yet what if contemporary literature's urban bias gets in the way of imagining the concerns and forms of the suburban, the provincial, the peripheral, the hinterland, of space abandoned?
Borges, who some consider is at least in terms of Argentine literature, more than a fully 20th century writer, he's the sort of hinge connecting the 19th and the 20th century, chooses as his first sort of initial geographical location for his first books of poetry the meeting of the city and the countryside. He names this place Las Orillas, the shores. It's the place where the city meets the countryside, or as he defines it more accurately and more poetically at the same time, the street that has no opposite side, la calle sin vereda de enfrente. He finds this tension, this bridge between the rural world, which represents the more traditional, the older lifestyle, and the new city, which he didn't reject, which he wanted to sort of bring together with the countryside.
Since the rise of the industrial city, say in the last 150 years, literature has found new forms of expression, new ways of dealing with the rise of the industrial city, both in fiction and poetry, and it tends to split into two things. One is the panorama of the city as an entity, and then the other is the vignette of the neighborhood. So the question that I'm really raising is, how do we deal with the new city, which is the megalopolis? On the one hand, the megalopolis is almost too vast for a panorama, as we've known it in modernism. And then with the disappearance of the neighborhood, what's literature going to look like? What is going to be the expression of the megalopolis? So,
in the 19th century, different figures appeared that allowed the gaze of the writer to travel within a city. Perhaps the most famous character is one developed by Baudelaire called the flâneur. He is someone who can confidently read the city and its inhabitants. Or as better interpreted by Walter Benjamin, he reads people's characters not only from the physiognomy of their faces, but via a social physiognomy of the streets.
I mean, even if you spend every day of your life walking around the city, at one point you find out you've followed certain routes, again and again, sort of, wearing in the flaneur wears a sort of rut into the city streets. And other areas you have never visited, you don't even know they exist, and if somebody takes you to them, you go ahead and say, this cannot be my city, this is not where I live. So I thought of, the 20th century solution for that is, in a way, the detective. He usually starts in the house of the rich, in the houses of the rich, but then the investigation takes him through all the differentiated social geography of the city, and usually the inside of the life in the slums. That's another limitation of the flaneur. I mean, as he's an observer and he walks the streets, he sees the life of the street, not the life of the interiors. As there are no private eyes in Buenos Aires, and if they are ex-cops, and you don't want an Argentine ex-cop for your narrator. I mean, you can have him as a character, but I tried it once. I tried to get into the skin of an Argentine chief of police, and that was a miserable failure. But it was a emotional one. I hated the guy. I mean, I hated his guts, and I couldn't be in his guts. So I stepped out.
Some of the relevant factors in the modernist anatomy of the city may impinge on the detective in his or her search to make sense of the modern city. Marshall Berman, commenting on Baudelaire's depiction of 19th century Paris, writes that the distinctive sign of 19th century urbanism was the boulevard, a medium for bringing explosive material and human forces together. The hallmark of 20th century urbanism has been the highway, a means of putting them asunder.
The extreme case of that is Los Angeles. I mean, because Los Angeles is a city that exists almost entirely in movies, and also, in fact, if you go as an outsider to Los Angeles, you have no sense of the city at all. I mean, your image of the city, everything you know about Los Angeles comes from the movies, and even when you go there, you still don't know anything about Los Angeles.
Kyle, in her review of this movie, she said that people sort of cheered and clapped because who would care if Los Angeles is destroyed? I mean, it never really existed. existed.
When I was in Iowa City, I was telling people a lot about where I come from and explaining what it actually is, this strange, obscure place of Bratislava. And just 1 year later, I was receiving all these funny emails because there was an American movie, a B-movie called Hostel, where 3 young Americans have about $15 in their pockets, and they travel to Eastern Europe and they come to Bratislava, where they can live for weeks with $15, like hedonistic lives. And basically, it's been produced by Quentin Tarantino, and I love the tagline of the movie, which is "Welcome to your worst nightmare." And basically, they describe the Slovaks as every Slovak is a mass murderer and every Slovak woman is a prostitute. The Slovak Republic really sent a diplomatic note to Hollywood and asked for apology from Quentin Tarantino for presenting our country in this way. Of course, the movie was absolutely not shot in Bratislava, but in Český Krumlov, which is 300 miles away, but who cares?
This question of pop representations of certain cities, which usually are associated with the cinema, and I think we have ignored or even repressed the question of the city represented in the cinema, as if only writers, novelists, and poets are the ones representing them. Perhaps because we all feel that the power of cinematographical representation is so much greater. You know, we all, for a great part of the world, Mexico City is Amores Perros, or Mumbai is Slumdog Millionaire. Well, in our writing as writers, rather than just feel that the one strategy is to combat this or to combat the stereotyping with the truth, sometimes it's to take it up. I mean, I attempted something along these lines, not so much having to do with the cinema, but when thinking about representing the shanty, and I saw that previous attempts in Argentine literature were, again, in this case, to give the truth as against bourgeois stereotypes about what happened in the shanties. And I said, no, I'll do the opposite. I'll take the bourgeois stereotypes, exaggerate them, take them to the point of absurdity, and maybe in that way, well, try to not represent directly, but to suggest the reality of those places, a sort of negative, of these stereotypes. And I think if you don't address the stereotypes as produced by popular culture, cinema mainly, you don't purge them.
Stop judgment and trying to hear the phenomena that are talking to you when you get into the city. The city asks you to fragment your experiences and try to exorcise the danger of producing or only seeing stereotypes.
Looking at it from the literary perspective, we also experience something what I would call tribalization of culture, which separates into different languages, national identities, strengthening, this narrow understanding of diversity, which focus very much on difference or on separateness of languages and so on, but losing universal level, losing something what helps people to coexist, to live together, to name the space as a whole, to embrace city, which is multicultural, as a whole.
There is a temptation for many writers, represented by this ominous word totality, actually trying to represent the totality through addition. And in that case, I think there is a danger of a certain banality, because some areas you know well, you were perhaps born in them, you grew up in them. Some areas you moved into, or you made yours, but others will be forever alien to your, not only to your actual experience, but sometimes to your imaginative experience, because literature is not so necessarily about lived experience. The other way, the one I favor, is through this figure you call synecdoche, representing, let's say, the whole through the part that suggests the whole, or allows one to imagine it. The big difference is that you don't need to force yourself into representing areas, zones, places, people you have no feeling for. I mean, when you are in your city and you say, this is not my city, I don't know where I am, that feeling can also be a source of powerful writing. Maybe you can create the void which the reader can fill in with his imagination of the city.
But there is no language of agora. There is no language of living together. Even in my small town, there are different stories of the city: Lithuanian, Polish, Jewish, Russian, in each language, and there is no common story for the city. So for my work, it's of incredible importance to recreate or reinvent a common story for the city. A story which, somehow embrace all the borders inside, all the cultures, religions into one novel, and to be acceptable and readable for all citizens of the city as our. And I think it's a very interesting challenge for literature today.
Today we are coming back to re-evaluating, not re-evaluating, in other words questioning, but rather giving more value to the spiritual in our world, because I think we have gone through the road of modernity, modernization, etc., etc. I think we have reached now the limit, and there is the way back. We just started the way back, and I think this economic crisis is probably the beginning of a return to something that probably would be the spiritual.
Research in language studies has not customarily been carried over into the domain of mystical discourse. The translation of Sufi literature becomes a way of reintegrating the sacred with the secular, making us see beyond the mere referential value of word-object relationships. It offers a dynamic and creative view of language.
It is surprising that almost all the Sufi poetry is about wine. What is the wine? It is the spiritual love, the feeling of love. And when you have this feeling, and then the poetry comes, like if you when we are intoxicated, then you become poet sometimes. Hein?
Mais le sophisme se pratique à 100% et tous les jours de l'année. Et alors, aucune personne aujourd'hui sur la planète ne peut pratiquer le sophisme 100% et tous les jours de l'année.
C'est difficile.
C'est tellement difficile. On ne peut pas être, comme on dit, Jean du four et Jean du moulin. On ne peut pas être à la fois dire chaud et froid, non. Jamais.
Ou chaud ou froid, ça y est.
I think if there is a principle really that we could advance as the organizing principle of everything that we have seen and lived through this experience is the sacred principle. And the spiritual has a way of defining identity more than anything else. It is a fact that the values that we have lived on since the beginning of the modern era have now come to their apory, to their emptiness, and they are no longer capable of giving us a sense of life.
ملي جوزتهم 12 عام وانا معه، لو مانيش شوكت معه او حديثه هدي 7 سنين ولا قد مرض وجاته مشى في العمر، والراجل عنده 110 وتوفى مشى لعند الله، مشى لعنده خلى لي 8 ديال الدراري وكف بلا كلام بلا حتى شي حاجه ولحقناها كناكلها بجد الله. انا وصابري مضاعفه ومساكن، احنا ضعفاء ومساكن وعايشين بالله وقانعين كيفاش كتر الله بجهد الله بجهد الله.
You have a civilization that still lives its paradigm, it is founding principle, its living organizing principle every day from the time you wake up in the morning until night is still shaped and transformed by that principle.
I am very curious. I mean, I do think that many of the ideas at this symposium had been shaped by implicitly or explicitly by the fact that we're in a city that constantly mobilizes and taps into that open metaphor of sacredness and how sacredness then constitutes itself for a number of different people. I think had we been in Sao Paulo or Iowa City for that matter, the idea of sacredness would not have been as prominently on our minds.
And you are absolutely right. if you apply this to, Sao Paulo or to Jakarta, well, probably not to Jakarta because there is a little bit of sacredness there. Well, then we are faced with an apory that is very difficult to understand in our modernist terms, because we believe that things are based on efficiency, based on cost benefit, and so on and so on. And that does not get into the picture of the sacred.
In my opinion, it's the problem of lack of money here. And the people here are suffer from their conditions of life. They are poor and they don't have a good opportunities of work. I studied English literature and American civilization. But work, I don't work now. I don't have a work.
Some of us were also singing hymns to the beauty of downward mobility, and I sort of go easy on that. I mean, we in Buenos Aires, we have PhDs driving taxis or working at call centers, and it's not that they've found themselves in some other sphere of life, but just that they couldn't get any other job. So once again, I think that we should be careful, and in that I agree with. I mean, a part of what Mustafa said. I don't believe that what you see here you don't see anywhere else in the world. You see it in India, you see it in parts of Latin America. There are many examples. I mean, maybe you want to make a point against the first world against the third world, but not Islam against the rest of the world.
No, I said West, the West. I did not say, I said West.
But I agree that sometimes before interpreting, we need some facts.
I feel uncomfortable with all this idea of Western and Eastern civilizations. I really cannot understand why people hold to it, especially people from this part of the world, because it was a notion invented by the foreign British State Department to describe some part of their dominion. Culture always works in many layers. The nature of language in poetry and in literature is often not to work in one and only sense. There is no one sacred. There is not one good poetry.
Generalizations in writing and speaking, they're not just not that interesting, they're also quite dangerous. And what I'll work at more kind of is just this idea that, driving towards the deeper subject, the poem ought to always be going as intricately into the interior as possible until it can go no further. So to hear, the large statements, Mustafa, that you make about that the sacred here lifts everyone up, we can't know that at all. And the most that we could see was the intricacy of the interior life of the architecture, but the interior life of the people, we don't know. We can't know that at all. And the large generalizations to me are exactly what hurt. They hurt poetry. They hurt the novel. They hurt the essay.
At least I know the general picture. Then I go to the particulars. But if I do not have a sense of what a civilization or a culture represents, then I'm off track completely.
It's a methodology. It's just a difference of methodology. I don't agree with. That's going to bring a different novel than some other kind of novel that begins differently. That's all.
One of the things that was striking to me is how far we traveled in time, and what is the writer's what are the writer's options in accommodating such vast spans of time that we've experienced. The further we went out of Fez, the further back in time we went to the place where people were literally living in caves. How does a cave dweller transform our sense of the human condition? What does that create in a writer's imagination and in the sense of representation of the city?
I just want to say that I think this whole cave thing is exaggerated because, after all, her house wasn't worse than a trailer park in America. I mean, it's not, you know what? And I've been in cave dwellers like in Cappadocia. It was cooler. I mean, I've been in cave dwellers in houses in Cappadocia that were actually a little nicer. I mean, that were better furnished, but they were also in caves. But so it seems like that's kind of an exaggeration, that this is the man at his most primitive living in a cave. Well, you know, I think Trailer Park is probably a lot worse, you know.
At the same time, I mean, you know, going back to Fez, somebody felt like it was back to 8th century. But if you see the city from the top of the hotel, you see all those dishes. And like, that's like more dishes than Capita in New York, for instance. And you know, so there are layers of time, and our eyes choose to see, you know, what we're seeing. And I think that as a traveler, we tend to see the archaic better than other aspects of life.
You have the experience, you cross time, you refer to somebody else, and then you come back to yourself, and every one of us has its own system of metaphors. The labyrinth. Okay, that has to do, in my opinion, and according to my system of metaphors, for example, with the ear, the labyrinth of the ear. When we had lunch in that place in Fez, oh, it was so beautiful, and then I heard the muezzins from the mosque all around. I mean, and it was the voice, something which we don't have in our own cities. We don't have the voice, we have the noise. Actually, and the big one.
The challenge for us is think rather not about how to identify ourselves, you know, and to struggle for our different identities, but to think how to coexist simply. The problems we have in our cities, you know, in modern cities, you know, to think about Fez in symbolic terms, of course, not as a coming to the past, coming to the history, coming to something what belongs to tourists and guides, but something what can challenge our reality and give you some thoughts about what coexistence could be today.
Set against the utopian past of the coherent and unified traditional city, the modern sprawling metropolis is larger than any book, indeed larger than the collected works of any single author. Is it in the interest of literature to attempt to reclaim or create totality so as to harmonize the dissonant forces that shape the city? Poet and philosopher Heidegger talked about inhabiting the language of the modern city, thus rediscovering its function and essence. One can regain familiarity and not have to speak of order or totality. As he put it, one goes to collect things and bring them back. The harvest is in itself a choice of what needs shelter. On the back burner of literary work is the idealized realm of the pastoral. One can invariably escape the oppressions of the city with a trip into the country's therapeutic rural landscape, with plenty of space to criticize urban values.
والمدينة ما كتبتش لينا الوقت، ما عطاتش لينا الوقت نعيشوا في المدينة. احنا تابعين الوقت. وراه كبرت نيت في المدينة وما رزقهاش ليا الله.